Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Sidney Sachs, and today I'd like to welcome Margo Williams. Welcome, Margo. I'm delighted to have you here. And she's going to talk to us about African-American genealogy and how that's a little bit different from the general genealogy. How did you personally get involved in it?
Well, I got involved, I think, pretty much the way most genealogists get involved, and that is by trying to look for my own family.
Had your parents been interested? Did they care?
My parents were not particularly interested, but my father's sister was very interested and had very carefully kept the family stories.
Oh,
and she wrote, when I was about 7, she wrote out the family story for me with complete with biblical begats.
Okay, once you got beyond that, what kind of resources did you begin by using?
Probably the very first resource I used was a book, the name of which at this point escapes me, but a book that I was reading on how to do genealogy. And I happened at that point to move to the Washington, D.C. area and decided I would try my hand by going to the National Archives.
Okay, that's of course certainly a good place, and then the Library of Congress if there are any published books. Now, what happened when you got into the point where they were free or slaves or so on? What happened then, or where do you go then?
Then you have to look in a different kind of records. You have to then move to the records of the slave owner, in particular their property records. And the most useful, or among the most useful records, would be the probate records, because in inventories and distributions of estates, you will have the slaves named, sometimes even named by family group, with father, mother. Their ages are often recorded, and so forth. So you get a lot of information from those records, and then you can follow where the slaves go to, whether they're sold at auction or whether they are willed or distributed to some other family members, and then you can begin following them again from that next owner.
Do the slaves appear in census records, or are they just listed as that many slaves? Or?
Slaves by name are usually not listed in the census records during slavery, prior to emancipation. There are a few exceptions to that. You can find a few records in a few places. Some areas in what are now West
slaves versus the free blacks.
Free blacks records should be found in the records of the general public as a rule. So they are able to buy land or marry, and so their records will be in the courthouses. They marry, they buy land, sell land. They conduct their lives pretty much the way that other individuals do. There were certainly legal restrictions on their movements, but not such that would be affecting your genealogy research as a rule.
What about web pages? You mentioned there's a whole bunch. We're not going to go into them all, but there are a lot of web pages that are.
There are a number of web pages that are devoted to African American genealogy. You can obviously put that into a search engine and come up with any number of them. Ancestry.com, which is probably the most popular genealogy.
And they will. Anybody that's watching the show can go to tracingroots.nova.org, and under a little description of this show, we'll list all of the web pages that you mentioned and have them as links.
That would be great.
So people can go to them that way.
So there, many of the sites have special sections devoted to African American genealogy, such as Ancestry.com, but there's also the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, which is a national society devoted to African American genealogy and as well as history, but really focused more on the genealogical and the parts of history that affect the genealogy, as opposed to some of the other historical societies that might be out there.
Now your Black Society do individual societies associate with that, or do you just join that?
We have local chapters. You can join individually, but we do have local chapters as well, and there are chapters in the D.C. area and Prince George's County, and I'm not familiar with one in Fairfax County, an actual chapter in Fairfax County, but obviously one could attend meetings of any of the local chapters in the area.
I think that's so important. We always say that. We always try to push the societies for Jewish genealogy to the networking that you get in a society, and the individual help is better than anything else that you can find, I think. What about the problem of last names, particularly?
Last names can pose some problems, but in terms of doing research, it's always best to start with what you know and then move to what you don't know. So what you know are the names that are in your family currently. So you work with those names, you find out from your family stories what families your ancestors were associated with, what white families they were associated with, and then try looking in those records. Look for those names and see if any of those names are associated with any of your earlier ancestors. And you may find, particularly at the end of the Civil War, that some of your ancestors changed their name periodically, that in the beginning they weren't settled. They may have started with whatever the slave owner's name was, then moved to some other name that they felt more comfortable with for any number of reasons. Sometimes something as simple as Lincoln was their hero, and they chose Lincoln for their last name.
And you mentioned George Washington Carver had changed his name several times?
Booker T. Washington, yes. He wrote in Up From Slavery that his family had changed its name 3 times before settling on using the Washington
when they change their names, does that have to go through a legal process, or did they bother doing that, or they just began using them?
They just began using them. Mm-hmm.
So that if you had George Smith or George Lincoln, at what point do you realize that that's the same person?
It's hard to say specifically what point. It would depend on your research. You would begin to know based on other kinds of research around you. So for instance, there's a gentleman who was actually a well-known African-American poet, Alfred Isley Walden, and he was known as Isley Smitherman. He was a Smitherman slave, but it is thought that he had a father by the name of Walden, and after he was free for a period of time, he did take the name Walden. And just once I was able to find a document where he was identified as Isley Smitherman, but most of his life in freedom after slavery, he was known as Walden.
So you get it by associating things.
Right.
I guess
you have to, as in all genealogy, you have to look at a number of resources, a number of pieces of information, and fit the pieces together as a puzzle.
What about legal status, or I guess, I don't know.
Legal status of, I'm not sure which.
I don't know, we were talking about it before.
Or
yeah, like when they were sold, I mean, all of these records exist then, whether when they were sold or when they became free, when they were freemen.
Well, different records become available depending upon what's happening in the individual's life. If an individual is sold, in many places, a deed of sale will turn up in the land records, in the deeds and other registers, but sometimes not. I always say just about everything in genealogy, there's a sometimes not. So sometimes not, but in many places you will find them listed in the deeds, in the Deep South in particular. When they were freed, manumissions are supposed to be filed. So a statement saying that this person was freed either by the court or because their owner decided to free them, either in their will or for meritorious service, and a statement would have to be filed. Again, you would find it in the deeds. It would be called a manumission. Yes.
But
if someone is transferred from family member to family member through the probate process, say they're inherited, or they're moved over because of marriage, you may or may not find a specific document outside of the probate records themselves. And in a marriage, the only way you would know is because someone married, and you would have to start then searching the family of the bride, let's say. Yeah. Such as the case in Sally Hemings came with Thomas Jefferson's wife. She was half-sister to Thomas Jefferson, and when he married his wife, she came as one of her personal slaves. I
never realized that. What about the Ball family? You mentioned that before. What was the...
The Ball family was a very large slave-owning family in South Carolina. And Edward Ball, a descendant, has written a book called Slaves in the Family, where he has traced, not only told the stories of his own family, other descendants, white descendants, but he has tried to locate as many of the slaves that the family owned and their descendants. And he was really quite successful with that, and therefore wrote his book called Slaves in the Family. And some of those descendants are, in fact, biological relations as well.
And they do that from the records, or word of mouth, or DNA testing, that they're, that they were biological members of the family?
Some of the individuals, it was very much common knowledge, and didn't really require very much researching to do. They knew who some of those individuals were, as many families actually do. They know who their black relatives are in the South frequently, and many times there are long-standing relationships that continue to the present day. Family reunions frequently involve inviting members from the other side to join you and be part of your family experience.
Now, you mentioned that the DNA testing can, there's two kinds of DNA testing we've talked about on our show before with family tree DNA, and then you talked about another kind of testing.
Fingerprint testing, they call it, fingerprint testing, and that's an effort to identify the communities in which your DNA might have originated from and can be found in today around the world. And so the idea is not so much to be able to say definitively that your DNA is exactly this particular ethnic group, but rather that your DNA is similar to an ethnic group found in a particular place. And it probably means you have shared roots of one kind or another. The confusion can come in, for instance, in my case, I have DNA matches, fingerprint matches with the Puerto Rican community, and with all of the research that I've done, I have absolutely no family history in the Puerto Rican community. But what it does mean is that I have a DNA mix, African, Native American, and European, that is very similar to that found in Puerto Rico, that I do have through other DNA testing. I do know that I have roots in the Iberian Peninsula. So that would show that my type is similar to that world community today, but it means we probably have roots in the same places, more so than that I actually am Puerto Rican.
It shows that you've got a lot of different directions to go to in your research.
Yes.
That's interesting and difficult. How many directions can you personally go into? Or have you gotten back to, like, you haven't gotten to anybody in that Iberian Peninsula, I suppose?
Not to an individual, no. I have not gotten to a specific individual. Among other things, there's been a great deal of migration around the world in general, far more than we give credit. And so that Iberian ancestor could go back quite a ways. My DNA really more contemporarily goes into the British Isles and Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, where there is actually a great deal of Iberian DNA for any number of reasons. And so my Iberian ancestor may really have more to do with my English ancestry than it has to do with a direct ancestor who came to these shores, let's say from Portugal or Spain, just across the ocean, just so. Although that's a possibility as well, of course.
It's just fascinating. I know this whole DNA thing of what they're finding and the patterns and all. It's just amazing to me. I can't even read my own notes. What kind of... the other thing you mentioned was the historical societies, how important they are for your kind of research. Do you want to talk a little bit about
historical societies are very important for my kind of research. I think possibly
for all research.
They're for all research, but because we're working with fewer records, generally published, available records than some other groups might be working with. It's important because the historians in those local historical societies, they know the families, they know what's been going on in terms of who's related to whom and where families came from and how long they lived there and who married whom and all that sort of thing. They are able to give you a lot of information about the families and the connections that African American families have with some of the European American families in those areas.
Well, didn't you say they have the unpublished kinds of things, like a family didn't know what to do with their documents?
That's right. They also have many private sources, resources that you may not find anywhere else. There may be letters or church records, church pamphlets and things that are available in their resources that are not necessarily available in the larger state libraries or archives.
And you said they have periodicals or
Some of them have their, because they're associated, well, usually the historical societies have some sort of either newsletter or journal. Sometimes they even have genealogy societies associated with them, and then in addition have a genealogy publication as well that would be focused on the genealogy of that particular county, in which case you're able to learn a great deal.
What about the Freedmen's collections and things like that?
Freedmen's records are federal records.
Oh.
It was actually called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen and Abandoned Lands. And so there are a lot of records for anyone doing Southern research that would be of interest. But certainly for African Americans, among the most widely published records at the moment are the Freedmen Savings Bank records, and they were a bank that was set up for the freed slaves to come and be able to put what little money they had. But the records provide an enormous amount of information because they ask them, what slave owner did you have? Who's your wife? Who were your children? Okay. Where did you live? Where were you born? Sometimes they have that information and sometimes it's complete, but sometimes it's not. But it can be quite a find when you do find a record with all of that information in it.
Where do you look for those?
Those are on the web.
Oh,
they're
wow.
available. They're certainly available at Ancestry.com, but at a number of websites and through narrow.gov, the National Archives itself.
At NARA. I do want to say too, for our audience, at least in Fairfax County, Ancestry.com, which is a paid genealogy site, is available at all the libraries.
That's right.
For free. So it doesn't mean you have to go over to the library, but that's not terribly far to go.
That's right.
Usually.
Many libraries now are making that available to their
It's
patrons.
expensive for the libraries, but it's expensive too if you want to.
If you're an individual trying to
do that. Now you also mentioned something about Missouri kinds of collections.
I was saying that many states are now making a concerted effort to identify records that are of interest to African American researchers. And Missouri was one of the states that published all of their records relating to the U.S. colored troops. Mississippi has been working on marriage records and freedmen's records. So you need to find out what your state is doing, which can be learned either through your state library or through your state archives.
Is much of this online then?
A great deal of it is online. Almost everyone these days has an online resource of one kind or another.
So if you know your family or your ancestry came from Missouri, you could look at the Missouri site and then...
You could look at their state online database. At the very least, it would tell you what records are available and what would be the process for getting access to them if the records themselves were not actually available as an online database.
One thing I forgot to ask when we talked about historical societies, do they answer mail much, or do you really have to go there? I mean, would they do research for you if you requested, do you have this person in anywhere?
If you can provide a fairly succinct request, they are usually happy to assist you, or at least tell you how. And if they're not able to handle the request, that is, if they're too busy, they usually know who would be a local researcher, and they'll send you that name and address so that you can, and phone number or email address or however that person wishes to be contacted, so that you could contact them and ask them, make arrangements with them for having the research done. I would say if you got a local researcher, it would probably be for a small fee, or a moderate fee. I don't want to say a small fee, a moderate fee.
Moderate fee. Well, they're doing work for you, unless you can.
Yes.
I as a genealogist, I've done work for others, and then somebody else has done something for me too. Sometimes I've paid.
Yes.
Sometimes
yes.
It depends what they.
It depends on what the situation is. So yes.
Now, what about? We've mentioned some of the state records. There's county tax records, and there's land taxes.
Oh, there are records that are available on a state level as well as the county level. So when you go to local courthouses in the county level, you will find one type of record, but you may need to go to a state library or a state archives to identify records that might have actually been gathered for state purposes. And something like land taxes.
Now, you mentioned something that I was very surprised about, that there had been African Americans as far back as the Civil War, and that some of them had come as slaves.
The Revolutionary War we were talking
I'm sorry,
about.
yes.
The Revolutionary War. Yes, indeed. There were African Americans in colonial Jamestown and in colonial Williamsburg. And
now, if there were free blacks back then, did they fought in the Civil War, in the Revolutionary War as well?
Yes, they did fight in the Revolutionary War, and there is in process the building of a monument to the African American soldiers of the Revolutionary War.
I guess I just never really thought about it. Now, what about newspapers and things like that as a resource?
Newspapers can be a resource. Newspapers can have information about runaway slaves or sale of slaves. It can indicate when someone has died, when a slave owner has died, which can lead you to looking for the probate, the time period to look for the probate. But there were also newspapers that were associated with the African American community really quite early on. They go back much farther than most of us would think, even into what we would call the time of slavery. And of course, in the North, there were a number of papers that were being published.
And there were enough blacks in the South that I'd always heard that they weren't allowed to read, or there were laws against them reading.
Well, the newspapers were geared towards those who were free and could read, were allowed to read. Slaves were not allowed to be taught to read in some places, but some of them were taught for reasons that the slave owner had. They either did so usually for their personal reasons, that they wanted the slave to be able to read, to do certain things. But some slaves also learned to read clandestinely. Sometimes they learned over the shoulder of a white child.
Where would you find these papers?
The newspapers?
Yeah.
You can find them, some of them are in the National Archives, in the newspaper collections, but they're in newspaper collections of a variety of institutions, state archives.
And would the historical societies also have them, do you think?
They might know if there were any local papers that they would know.
That at least point you in the right direction.
They would point you in the right direction, exactly.
What about the underground railroad? I mean, obviously it had to be secret, but are there anything?
Exactly. It did have to be secret in order to protect those who were helping to, who were station masters, they called them, those who were helping the runaway slaves. But there were also the slaves themselves. But yes, there are sometimes diaries and logs and journals or memories that have been written by various station masters. So there are some records that have survived.
And does anybody, well, is there any kind of record of where these people went afterwards, or is that again just that you'd find out for family?
You have to do the usual searches to find where people have gone, usually based on family stories. Usually you know that there's someone who moved to Ohio or went to Canada, and so then you start looking and see what you can find out.
What are there any other resources that you can think of that we should be mentioning that we haven't mentioned?
Well, as we said, the National Archives and the DAR, the Library of Congress would be the large ones. Your state archives and libraries, your county history, your county historical societies, your county courthouses, and then, of course, you have resource places such as the family history centers associated with the Salt Lake Family History Library, and even sometimes just your local libraries.
And again, I guess the best thing to do is what you have to do first is start with your family.
I was going to say your family trunk.
Your interviews with.
Oh yes, always talk to your oldest living relatives in particular, and find out as much as you can from them. Become a nuisance to them. It's the only way you'll learn.
Yes, especially if they're not interested in genealogy. Why do you want all that old stuff? Who cares about it?
But once you learn a story and you tell and you begin to give them information, they have a way of suddenly remembering more and being just a little bit more interested. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's been very, very
my
interesting.
pleasure.
It's something that I know really very little about, and it's something that we really need to, another angle of the genealogy. Thank you.